to Lesson 9 of Fahrenheit 451, Generating a Research Question and Locating and Assessing Sources. We've been revising our writing to include parallel structure and adverbial phrases. Today we will generate a question for research. We will locate sources and assess each source's usefulness in answering the research question. Then we will determine whether to narrow or broaden the research question. For today's lesson, you will need the Conducting Research handout that was found in this lesson. This lesson gets us ready to begin the unit text for this unit, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Fahrenheit 451 has similar messages and themes to Frederick Douglass's autobiography and The Joy of Reading and Writing, Superman and Me by Sherman Alexie. There are several differences, of course, and we will definitely get into those differences. But before we get going and we leave Sherman Alexie and Frederick Douglass completely alone for a bit, I want us to think about what their message was to readers. And we're going to take a few minutes and discuss that message. So let's discuss. Fahrenheit 451 was written in the 1950s, and it is helpful to understand what life and society were like in the United States during that time. To do this, you are going to engage in a short research project. The first step is to generate a research question. So, we're going to look at the directions on the first page of the Conducting Research handout to generate our research question. So let's look at the Conducting Research handout. To generate a research question, you're going to choose one of the general topics below: politics in the 1950s, arts and entertainment in the 1950s, people and events in the 1950s, and science and technology in the 1950s. After you choose one of those general topics, I want you to think about what you would want to learn about and what you already know related to the topic. The area below number 2 is where you're going to brainstorm those ideas. Then I want you to choose one topic from your brainstorm from number 2 and create a question for your research. For example, if your topic is political figures, your question could be, who were the important political figures of the 1950s? You're going to type in your research question below number 3. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do so. The next step in the research process is to locate and assess sources. On the slide, there are different types of sources listed. And I want you to think for a second to consider the sources on the slide as well as the questions. Remember that before you research, you have to consider what makes a source credible and useful, and what process you will use to determine if a source is credible and useful. So let's discuss. Which ones of these sources are credible and useful? And how are we going to determine if they're credible and useful? On your conducting research handout, there is a strategy that we are going to use for assessing our sources. So let's look at it. This strategy is known as CARS because it creates the acronym that spells CARS: credible, accurate, reasonable, and supported. When we're talking about whether a source is credible, we want to know if the publisher is legitimate and if the author is an expert. In terms of whether it is accurate, we want to look at the date of publication. We want to make sure that the evidence, that the information does not contradict itself or conflict with information from another known source. And we also want to make sure that the information is relevant to your research question. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time. In terms of reasonability, we need to think about whether the publisher or the author has a bias toward the information, and in what way is that information balanced. In terms of whether it is supported, that refers to our sources. Are the sources listed? If so, how many are there? Are the sources easy to find? Now you are going to locate and assess two sources related to your research question. You're going to use the chart in the Conducting Research handout to record the sources you locate and the information from the sources that answers your research question. And it's not listed, but make sure if you're using an online source that you copy and paste the exact URL or web address so that you'll be able to access it later. I'm going to give you 15 minutes to work on finding and assessing your sources. Now I want you to listen as I think through narrowing or broadening my research question. Because once you have some information from credible, useful sources, you should pause to consider if you need to adjust your research question. We're going to use the checklist in the Conducting Research handout to determine if we should narrow or broaden the research question. So my research question is, who were the important political figures of the 1950s? So let's look at our checklist to determine if we should narrow it or broaden it. Based on my research from the beginning to now, is there information I've learned that makes me want to revise the research question? Well, I'm not sure yet. So let's look at the other two questions to make sure. Is there a more specific topic within the research question that I'm interested in pursuing? Well, I might want to focus in just on the presidents of the 1950s, or maybe the senators, or maybe just the senators and representatives from Louisiana in the 1950s. Or do I need to make my question broader to include more topics or information? And you see, that's something I need to consider as well. I think it's already broad enough. If anything, I might narrow it a bit, or I might just think about it in terms of general political figures. That's a you think kind of decision to make. Now, if you wish to revise your question, I want you to go back to number 3 where you typed in your research question and revise it there. So now I'm going to give you about 15 more minutes to continue your research. Continue looking at sources, assessing them, finding out if you can use the information within them during these 15 minutes. And now, dun dun dun, homework. You actually have 2 items for homework. First, you're going to create a poster to present the findings from your research. You'll need to include at least 5 key pieces of information that you learned. For this, you will need your conducting research handout, poster, or printer paper. I'm going to give you printer paper, but if you want to make it larger for it to be a poster, you can do so as well as crayons, colored pencils, markers, whatever you want to use to create your poster. Then, I want you to write a paragraph describing how the information you found in the sources helped you to answer your research question. For this, you're simply going to need your conducting research handout. Both are due at the start of class tomorrow. Or, the next class period. Congratulations! You have now completed Lesson 9 of the Fahrenheit 451 unit. In this lesson, you conducted research in order to learn more about the context in which Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451. You also practiced generating a research question, assessing the usefulness of sources in answering that question, and determining whether to narrow or broaden the research question.